Bună ziua și bine v-am regăsit la Transilvania Culturală. Este o onoare să vă prezint astăzi pe Venerabila Robina Courtin, o călugăriță budistă care a venit în România să vorbească despre tradițiile budiste. Hello and welcome to our show.
Hello Vasily, I'm happy to be here.
It's an honor for me.
Good.
Thank you for accepting this interview. My first question is, why did you turn to Buddhism?
Well, it was an evolution, really. I think since I was brought up in Australia, born in the mid-40s, Catholic mother, 7 children in the family, and I was somehow had a very natural connection with kind of so-called religious ideas. I loved God, I loved going to Mass, I joke and I say I was in love with God, and it was true. But what's also interesting, I was very rebellious and very naughty, so I think it was very internal. I didn't show it much, it was just inside me. But I think if I look at it, I was really mostly interested in the way things work and why things happen and what is happiness and why there is suffering. These types of things, it very preoccupied me. So I think I was very serious, a little girl, wanted to be a priest, these things, wanted to be a nun. And by the time I was 19, it was sort of 60s, I was hippie, drugs, these things, so I thought, goodbye God, hello boys, You can't have both. Absolutely. So I think I was still it was the same point that I was trying to understand the way things are, So first I was kind of a very intense hippie and then went to London, late 60s, ripe and ready for revolution, got caught up in all what was going on there, radical lefty demonstrations and then feminist, well actually black politics first, the Black Panthers, this type of thing, supporting that, and then feminist. And I think after many years, when I was in my late 20s, I really wanted something spiritual again. So then I found martial arts, and then I met these 2 Tibetan lamas. I was maybe 30 or something. And then I think, it was an evolution, it led to this. And then since that's what I've been doing. Somehow the Buddhist view, the Buddhist philosophical view, the Buddhist psychological view, the Buddhist way of life, this is what I find most appealing, so that's why I'm here.
Will you explain, please, some of the fundamental concepts of Buddhism?
Well, the essence of it is mind. So as soon as we hear that in the materialist world, we point to our brain. But the Buddha's got a very radically different view about what the mind is. He would say it isn't physical. He doesn't use a word like soul or spirit. There's no concept of a creator. Therefore, there's no concept of punishment, reward. The Buddha would sort of say we are our own boss. We are the ones our own consciousness, and we need to learn to know it deeply. The reason is because he says we can radically change it. So what he means by that is that we can, when we learn to know our own mind, one of my teachers says we need to learn to be our own therapist, and that's seriously true, but at a much more sophisticated, subtle level than I think we would tend to think in our materialist world. And this whole approach of going deeply inside, in a very clear way, I think is coming from the Indians, before even Buddha, more than 3,000 years ago. It was the Dalai Lama who said that was more than 3,000 years ago, who began this extraordinary investigation into the nature of self. So Buddha came out of that tradition. But I think in our kind of modern Christian Judaic culture, we know nothing about the Indians. We know lots about the Greeks, So I think we're very ignorant of the extraordinariness of these Indians, even before the Buddha. And Buddha came out of that one and then went in his own direction. So the idea of going deeply into your mind, and that's where we talk about meditation, is not just some hippie-trippy thing. It's actually a really clear, disciplined psychological skill that enables us to get enormously subtle focus at a deeper level, and so that we can unpack and unravel our own internal workings. That's really a way to say it. It's not the way they would say it in the texts, but that's really what you're doing. So that's the essence of being a Buddhist. So changing what? Well, he would say, he's found from his own experience, that all the unhappy parts of us, the ego parts, the fears and the jealousies and the dramas and the stuff that makes us happy, makes us suffer, and therefore causes us to make a mess of the world. Look at the world. He says they're not at the core of our being, and that's his essential finding. And then all of Buddhist practices and methodology are leading us to eradicating this rubbish from our minds, and then also enhancing and developing to perfection all the goodness in us. Speaking in a really simple way. That's the essence of being a Buddhist. So it's totally practical, and it's not, in that sense, it's not merely believing in something. There's no concept like that in Buddhism.
So meditation as a tool, why and how to meditate?
Well, it's this one I just mentioned, one particular skill. I think the world these days knows it vaguely as mindfulness meditation, and there's lots of interpretations of it. And that's reasonable, because Buddha is not a creator. He doesn't own the word meditation, so people can make up their own. But the essence of it in Buddhism is there's really 2 kinds. And they're simply tools to help us do that job I just said of unpacking and unraveling and radically reconfiguring our own actual very being, our own mind. So the first one is it's simply called concentration meditation. But it enables us to go to these subtler levels of our own consciousness that I think that our modern psychological models don't even posit as existing, which is why we think it's mystical, but it's not mystical. It's very subtle. But the first one is to concentrate, to step out of your own head so you can begin to become familiar with what's there, so we can do the job of being our own therapist in a daily sense. So then there's many other kinds of meditation, so many kinds. But I think there's a lot of misconception about the nature of meditation, as if it's either an alternative to a pill, or it's to make all the thoughts go away, or it's to bring some special vision, or it's to make us feel good. None of that's the point. It's like a training, a skill to begin to train our chaotic minds. I mean, we know, don't we? From the second we wake up in the morning until the second we go to bed, underneath all the stuff that we're doing on autopilot, there's constant, unceasing, like a river of thoughts under there, and we just never pay attention. We only pay attention when it comes to the surface and comes out the mouth, you know? So we have to learn to become deeply familiar at a more subtle level. But it's a very rigorous training. It's not just some hippie mystical thing. That's one of the biggest misconceptions, I'd say. And this concentration is just a technique, it's like a training that enables you to then do the job of really, and that means, of course, becoming responsible and becoming accountable for what's inside us. And that means not blaming others for my happiness and not blaming others for my suffering. And there's a lot of talk in Buddhism about that, you know, in Buddhist psychology.
I want to know from you, what is the source of evil?
So maybe you need to tell me what you mean by that. Define your terms first, Vasily, and then I'll give you my Buddhist opinion.
I will talk about disturbing emotions.
So, but you said the word evil first, and then you said disturbing emotions.
Yes.
I mean, people will hear those terms as quite different. So what do you mean by the word evil? That's quite an intense word, isn't it?
Evil in the world. Like
so you mean people doing bad things to each other, basically?
To other
well, then, okay, let's do the analysis. From the Buddhist perspective, everything comes from the mind. So in the Buddhist view, we can divide the contents of what's in here. I mean, there's thousands and thousands of thoughts, and it is so complex, but the Buddhist model would divide the contents into three categories, really. And this almost initially sounds quite simplistic, but it's dealt with in great depth in the Buddhist literature. So the first level, the so-called negative, the terms, obviously you've read some Buddhist literature, you know the term disturbing emotion. Yeah. Well, there's various synonyms for these. Disturbing emotion, mental affliction, it's one of the terms. The word delusion, I think Buddha would have liked the word neurosis, you know. All the stuff that we kind of know completely, anger, jealousy, depression, anxiety, we can even say paranoia, all these words we use in modern day, they're all the unhappy parts of us. So I think the point is, in our models of the mind, we give equal status to them along with the good qualities, love, compassion, intelligence. And I think there's an assumption very deep in modern science and in modern psychology, and Buddha certainly would disagree with this, that this is just a normal human being. We hope it doesn't get extreme, which is where it gets to the level of evil. We hope the good stuff is there. We sort of cross our fingers a bit and hope we'll turn out okay. I would suggest we don't have very many methods to really do that job, but that's literally the Buddha's approach is we can do the job ourselves, but we first have to identify the difference between anger and compassion, attachment and love, and right now they're mixed together like vegetables in a soup. We can't distinguish. So that's why we have to have this skill to look and then do the unpacking. So the Buddha's fundamental view is that these neuroses are not at the core of our being. So therefore that's why he says we have to become familiar with them so we can start to unpack them and change them. So evil then is what we do with our body and speech basically to harm others, isn't it? So we can clearly see some people are pretty evil. So Buddha would say it comes from the neuroses in the mind, and they're intensely deep. So then an added point here, which is where it sounds a bit mystical, but Buddha's view about the mind is it doesn't come from a creator. Your consciousness, your mind, these are synonymous. Nor do your thoughts and feelings and emotions and love and compassion or anger or being good at football, those tendencies don't come from your parents. Now that's a big shock. And that really needs thinking about carefully to see what he means by that. And this is where we have to say, at least take here as a hypothesis, Buddha would suggest that our consciousness doesn't begin in the mother's womb, it goes back and back and back. And that's a fundamental, in Asia for years that's been one of the natural philosophies. They call it the law of karma, and this concept of consciousness not being the handiwork of God or parents. So it's an interesting idea. And Buddha says basically we come programmed, not with our mummies and daddies' tendencies, but with our own from the past. So we can see there's Mr. Hitler, but then you can see Mother Teresa, you know, the good ones. We come programmed with that. There's Mozart, you know, so we come with our own tendencies, good or bad. So then, of course, the job is to see them, and this is the hard part, because our science and our psychology, and we instinctively assume my anger comes from you because you're not kind to me. You understand my point? So naturally, if I want to, I don't think I should change my anger. I think you should change because you're the blame.
No,
so
anger, it's mine.
It's very deep, isn't it? So the Buddha's view is say, yeah, you might be a mean guy, you might be a horrible boyfriend, but that's his problem, Robina. Yours is your anger, darling. So that's a big shift because it means you've got to look inside and not out there. And that's very hard for us, I think. But that's the Buddha's approach. That even if you are a bad person and are harming me, it's true. If I can get away, fantastic. But still I can work on myself. And that's why I found it very powerful working with people in prison. I ran a non-profit in America mostly, started in the mid-90s, and I had contact with thousands of prisoners, and they were the ones who wanted, you know, they wrote to us, they wanted meditation, they wanted Buddhist philosophy. And because they're in these dreadful situations, because the prison system in America is pretty horrible, the sentencing is really intense, you know. I think that there's a kind of an accepted number that 5% America has 5% of the world population, but it's got 25% of the prison population, which means a quarter of all humans on earth who live in prison live in American prisons. So it's quite intense, you know. And unfortunately, I think it's going to increase with Mr. Trump. So really, so the thing is, my friends in prison, where they kind of literally can't change anything, they can't walk out that door. Whereas, so they are the ones I found so inspiring examples, because they know they can't change the situation, they can't get out. They can't change the mind of the judge or the jury or the police, but they know they can change their minds. And that's what I found really inspiring. And that's the essence of the Buddhist job, actually. The Buddha says, if you can change something, please change it. But if you can't, I mean, like, then what? That's when you do the inner work. And that's a tough one, because we'd always, almost in a sense, not in a sense, I think we instinctively feel, and I really believe our models of the mind use this as the basis, that you are the source of my happiness and you are the source of my suffering, which in a sense is I blame you for both, which means I cling to you to make me happy, and I push you away if you make me angry. That's okay, but he says we've got to look at the stuff in here and change that. That's what's kind of literally liberating. You understand? That's the essence of being a Buddhist, really.
Would you expand a little bit of the idea of that according to the Buddhism, we are totally responsible for our evolution and development?
Well, in a sense, that's what I'm saying here.
Yes.
So if you know...
I see here a humanism.
Oh, of course it is. If you take away, you know, okay, if you look at the Tibetan Buddhist view, it's studied in great depth in these Tibetan Buddhist monastic universities. I mean, Tibet, 99% were Buddhist. A sixth of the population were monastic. So it has the trappings of what we call religion, you know. So those components are there, devotion and many practices. But the point of all of them in Buddhism is they're tools that you use, if you choose, to help you do this essential job I'm talking about. So even more than that, actually, I mean, this word Buddha, it's Sanskrit, and the Tibetan word, sangye, the etymology is very tasty. What's implied by the first syllable, sang, is the utter eradication of all the nonsense in our minds, which is a pretty insane concept. We don't have that in the modern world, but that's what he's found, the Buddha has found from his experience. Then the second syllable, gye, implies the development literally to perfection of all the intelligence and the positive qualities. This is a simple way of putting it. So then, because Buddha's not a creator, he doesn't assert a creator, he was a regular guy who did this work internally based on this amazing tradition he came out of. And he says every single human being can do this, has the potential to do this. We take the view, just for the moment, as our hypothesis, that our consciousness is this not physical energy that goes back and back and back and back and back, and then we become programmed with our own stuff. Then we are not just the product of what someone else did to me, including a creator. We are coming with our own stuff, and we can change it so I can produce my future. In the same way that if you want to be a pianist, you need Bach, you need Steinway, you need a good teacher. They're the catalysts, but you do the work. So in that sense, you are responsible to become a good pianist, but not coming from the sky. You've got to have all these extra conditions. So if I practice virtue and practice goodness and practice giving up anger and rage and harming others and practice compassion and kindness and intelligence, well then who do I produce? A marvelous person. So in that sense, we are the ones who have to do the work, rather than believing someone else made me and it's their fault, which makes us paralyzed and like a victim, you know. So that's the literal meaning, but it's a long-term kind of view.
What can you tell us about the public speaking in Cluj? You will talk about get real, how to live a life.
I'll be talking about exactly what I've been saying here.
Ourselves and the happiness and how to find it.
Exactly what I'm saying here, expanding on it. This is really, I mean, I'm speaking in a casual modern way, but I'm actually, every single word I'm saying here is valid Buddhist philosophy and psychology, you know, but spoken simply, and I think that's so important. If I just quote Tibetan terms, you know, ancient Indian, it just sounds so cosmic to us and so abstract, and then we put it in the realm of mystical, which is what we'd love to do with religion. But the Buddhist approach has got to be down to earth and doable, not just some interesting belief system, you know. So I find that really important to make it very practical. We're going to be talking more about the mind and how it works, and more about how to use these tools in your daily life.
What are disturbing emotions? How can we cope with them?
So in this Buddhist model of the mind, on the one hand, Buddha would agree with Western psychology. We almost have 1,000 thoughts a second, you know. And also, if we start to label them all just as thoughts, don't have generalized terms like obsessive or paranoid or something like that, but literal names for each of them, then you're going to have thousands of variations. But the Buddhist view, and we can see it in our lives, I think we can come down to half a dozen that are really central. So, you know, we know the word anger, we know the word depression, we know low self-esteem, anxiety, love, compassion, generosity, forgiveness. Attachment is a tricky word because we've got a different definition, but let's talk about that one. So if we start, or jealousy, for example, if we start to look into these and really look and unpack them in the way the Buddhist does, the Buddhist psychology does, very precisely, this is the heart of it, by understanding these deeply. So then, okay, so if we look at these categories, negative and positive, and they sound kind of simple. It's not a moralistic kind of label, you know. So the negative ones, there's like a hierarchy, I would say, and the root one that they talk about, the deepest one in Buddhist psychology, which I think we don't even have a term for in our models, is colloquially it's known as ego grasping. It's this primordially deep, unbelievably instinctive, primordially deep, kind of fear-based, neurotic, mistaken sense of a separate self. It's so primordial. And all of Buddha's teachings lead to this analysis, and it's quite deep, and there's meditations to unpack that one. That's when we achieve what they say, our nirvana, our liberation, but it's quite subtle. So the basis of all beings is this one, and this includes animals. And it's then on the basis of this intense, mistaken sense of a separate I, then we have this huge primordial clinging and grasping to get what that I wants to fill up the gaping hole, you know? So the energy of attachment is a huge word in Buddhism. In our culture, it's a good word. You become close to your beloveds, you connect with people, but this is a very different definition. It's another word altogether. So this attachment is, the most fundamental level is huge sense of dissatisfaction, a huge aching feeling of never being enough, never having enough, therefore naturally gives rise to the next facet of attachment, which is hankering, craving. What'll I have? Cake, bodies, things, knew this, knew that, go here, do there, change the job, always driven by this feeling somehow that I'll find that, then I'll get happy, you know? Very deep in it, it's very instinctive. Then that gives rise then to when you get the object, like the boy, if I fall in love with Vasily, we all know this attachment makes me berserk. You look like God incarnate, you're so handsome. I believe you're going to be now the cause of all my happiness, and I set it in stone, and now I say, finally I've found happiness, and then I'm going to have this massive expectation that you had better fulfill my expectations. And the millisecond you don't do what my attachment wants, that turns into aversion. Aversion becomes anger, or depression, or guilt, or annoyed, or frustrated. So we run between 1,000 times a day, Buddha's saying, between attachment and aversion, at a very subtle level, but when they're really gross, if you've got intense attachment, that's what we call compulsion, that's what we call addiction. And then the other one, when it's really very extreme, it becomes violent anger, evil, if you like, or profound depression. So this sounds kind of simple, but really it is dealt with in great depth. And because the Buddhist approach is to understand all this is an internal process. These great yogis and meditators of thousands of years ago, on the basis of this concentration, using this meditation technique, they literally mapped the mind internally. So when we map the mind, we map the brain. But this is an internal process. It's quite subtle and quite sophisticated, and this stuff goes quite deep, actually. But the words we know, you know. So doing this job of really knowing yourself well, and then we can see on the basis of attachment. So ego-grasping gives rise to, I must have something, craving, dissatisfaction, which gives rise to manipulating, grabbing, expecting, and then possessing, and then panic attack when it goes, or it, you know, or you leave it, or you don't get it. And then that's aversion, distress, despair, depression, or anger. And then jealousy and all the other dramas on top, you know. Speaking kind of simply. And look at that, we recognize these words, everybody recognizes. So if you've got extreme attachment, extreme ego grasping, extreme rage, that's what you call evil, you know. A person is driven by that and can't even see the option, can't even see a possibility. And then the tragedy about all this, even if it's mild or extreme, we know we're feeling angry. And then Buddha says, Robina, you know you could change it, darling. And I'll say, excuse me, why should I? Vasili's the problem. So we can't even own it, you understand? Because we really believe my anger's a source. You're the source. So that's the part that's really hard to see. And so it's not even easy to think that that's true, you know. But that's the Buddhist approach, to become deeply introspective, not in a cosmic sense, in a very clear, rigorous sense, and based upon the wish to take responsibility that it's my anger. Yes, you might be mean, but see what I can do with my own mind. That's the part that's tough, but that's the key. That's when the changes happen. And that, for the Buddha, this process of changing my own mind, that's the source of my happiness. No matter, I mean, I've got some friends in prison, death row, they can't get out, 30 years. They've, you know, using these tools to become happy, wonderful human beings. I'm not trying to be sarcastic or kind of cliched, because you change your mind. You stop being miserable, you stop being angry, you stop being resentful, you stop blaming everybody else. It's intensely hard work, but that literally is the Buddhist approach. And it's sort of, it's cognitive therapy. When we know cognitive behavioral therapy, it's a whole style, you know, of how to change yourself. We start with the concepts, but it goes ever more deep.
What would be a proper and efficient way to deal with one's ego?
Well, these are all the symptoms of ego. These are like the voices of ego. So this is where you have to have some concentration. You step out of your head and you have to start listening to all the crazy stuff there. I mean, whereas that's why if we mistake concentration, meditation as a technique to make all the pain go away, then you know, that's not helpful. If you've got cancer and you've got pain, take a painkiller. But just thinking you've solved the problem is very naive. You've got to get to the root of it. So it's nice to have a meditation where you can be calm, but the real job is so that you can see and hear what's happening in there more clearly throughout your day, and ever more, and then to take responsibility. They're the voices of ego. And then the other typical, the hard job, I mean, if I'm in love with Vasily, that's also mixed with some virtuous qualities. Love. I have lots of affection for you. I want you to be happy. That's love. I don't want you to suffer. That's compassion. I have generosity towards you. That's what our relationship, why it will be helpful. But the stuff that poisons is the other stuff. But our trouble is we can't see the difference. So if I say I'm attached to you and I love you, they're totally separate things for the Buddha. Attachment is this over-exaggeration of your loveliness, your over-exaggeration of your role in my happiness. Therefore I manipulate you to make you do what I want. Therefore I freak out when you don't. And that becomes anger. Whereas if I have more love and more kindness and more patience and more forgiveness, that's what makes me more reasonable, and that's what makes our relationship more reasonable. But it's hard to distinguish, you know. Or let's say even anger and compassion. You know, let's say I see a dog being kicked. I have immediate compassion for the dog, but then immediately I want to find someone to blame, then I'm going to get angry. So anger seems like a consequence of compassion, but it kind of poisons it. I mean, that's more complicated. So it's hard to distinguish between these positive qualities that the Buddha would say are actually at the core of our being and can be fully developed, and the neurotic, unhappy stuff, the voices of ego, which cause our pain, cause us to make a mess of our relationships. Because we assume they're normal, I think that even means for us you'd be abnormal if you didn't have them. So when we hear Buddhas say you can get rid of them, that sounds kind of weird, you know. So we've got to think of it carefully, what he means by this. It's a tricky job, a tough job, but it's a doable job. And that's being a Buddhist.
Buddha's expertise is the mind. But
that's right.
What does mind mean for a Buddhist?
Okay, I'll summarize the points that Buddha makes about the mind. What we just said then, we all recognize that. So whether we think they're the function of a brain or not, that's almost not the discussion, because we all know what anger feels like. We know these things. So the analysis is different. The Buddhist analysis, which is coming from internal work, as I say, you know, you ask a great yogi, even now in Tibet, who's never met a Westerner, where their brain is, he wouldn't have a clue. But you would suggest he knows his mind well from this internal work. So the Buddhist approach is that consciousness or mind, first of all, these words are used synonymously. Second, it's not, and this sounds a shock to us, we have to look into it carefully, it's not a function of the brain. It's not itself the brain. And that's why these marvelous conversations the last 40 years, organised by an American organisation called Mind and Life. I think we can see their website, mindandlife.org. They've organised these incredible conversations between the Dalai Lama and many of the best Tibetan Buddhist scholars, including the Westerners, and the best brains in the West. And so some of the findings in neuroscience, huge things have come from these fantastic conversations, and all have been published. So I think they're really incredible. So for the Buddha, mind is not physical, fundamental, and it's synonymous with the word consciousness. Second, it is not the handiwork of a creator. Buddha doesn't posit a creator. Third, it's not the handiwork of your mummy and daddy. Now that's the big shock to us. So mother and father give us a body, including a brain, genes, all these things, but the Buddha's view would say that consciousness is connected and interdependently exists with these phenomena, but is self-physical. Therefore, if it's not the handiwork, okay, the next point is Buddha would say your consciousness doesn't start in the womb, which either of those views would say. God puts the soul there, or mummy and daddy, the egg and sperm come together, right? But the Buddha would say your consciousness, your thoughts, like think of it as a river of mental moments. Go back and back and back. Then the second of conception, the moment before, egg was in mummy's body, sperm in daddy's body, but your consciousness has its own continuity. And of course, this is massively dealt with in all the literature. It's not just some hippie invention, you know. And therefore, this concept of reincarnation, so-called. So your consciousness goes back and back and back, and then it continues after you die. So it's not physical, not the handiwork of someone else, it's intensely personal. Whatever's in it is from it's from before. Like, you know, if you can access your being good at music today, we can deduce as a tendency to be good at music from doing it before, speaking simply, as well as love and hate and everything else. Third one, this is the radical point that's different from our culture, and this is indicated by what I said before, this, on the basis of this psychological technique called single-pointed concentration, we can access more subtle levels of our consciousness that we don't even posit as existing in our culture because they don't depend upon the brain. They're more subtle. And the next point is, of course, the point that I'm discussing here, Buddha's findings about the potential of this mind. And that's the meaning of the word Buddha, that we can rid the mind of all the rubbish and grow all the goodness, become a perfected being, which sounds pretty religious in concept, you know, cosmic to us. But that's the way Buddha talks about the mind. And then the analysis of how it functions. And I mean, when you study in the Buddhist monastic university system in Tibet, which is the basis of anything I'm saying here, when you study the mind in depth, you learn, first of all, the epistemological model of the mind, and that's utterly fascinating in Buddhism because it's the way the mind works, and it's quite complex, and it's from this internal, you know, this mapping of the mind that they've done, the way consciousness works, the way the sensory consciousness works, the way the conceptual states of mind work, all of these things, quite complex. Then you have the psychological model, which is what we're talking here, the contents, you know, and so so that's the way they talk about the mind in Buddhism. It's so very different in many ways, although the words, love, compassion, they're very familiar, you
know. Will you explain a little bit about nirvana being within the mind?
The nice analogy in Buddhism that a bird needs two wings, wisdom and compassion. So everything we've talked about so far is the nuts and bolts of the wisdom wing, understanding what the mind is, what is suffering, what is the cause of it, and we haven't talked about that much. The whole concept of karma, which for Buddha is a natural law, we haven't talked about that at all, but it's assumed. This is all the nuts and bolts of the wisdom wing, so that's the nuts and bolts of so okay, so then you've got the compassion wing, which is that on the basis of success in this, you then help others, benefit others. So a Buddha has these two wings. A Buddha is a person who's achieved two wings. Well, if you accomplish the wisdom wing, that's you achieve your own liberation. If you put the other wing onto it, you also are capable of helping others get liberated. So nirvana just means cessation of suffering and its causes. So if you finish on the wisdom wing, you've achieved your own nirvana. So it's the word you'd use to refer to that accomplishment. It's not an alternative to heaven. It's referring to what you've accomplished in your mind by ridding your mind of all the rubbish. And Buddha is the word you use for somebody who adds the compassion wing to it and is able to effortlessly help others. That's, you've achieved Buddhahood. So these are terms internal. They're internally accomplished, basically. The terms used to refer to your level of accomplishment, psychologically speaking.
What are the challenges you have met during your teachings Buddhism to the Western world?
Challenges are None. Okay, what happens? I mean, my job has been to teach for the last 30 years, also doing other jobs. I'm brought up, my father's a journalist, my mother's a musician. I'm, working as always as a journalist in my life. I joke and say I've always been on the propaganda side, and I have been. First of all, as a kid, we had a printing company. My father was a journalist, and our main clients for that company were the communist unions, workers' unions, and the Catholic Church. My mother was very eclectic. She helped run the business too. And then when I got a hippie, I was always on the propaganda, always doing the literature. Then I worked in publishing. And then I became on the radical left. I was always doing that. Then as a Buddhist, my main job was all these years, and still I edit books and write and edit a magazine. So they're the jobs I've been doing as well. So the challenges for me, the world is full of challenges. People don't like you sometimes, and we all know things happen. But if I'm really taking this job seriously, the main challenges are internal. My inability to deal with it, and that's because of my neuroses. So if I get angry and upset and jealous and depressed, they create the obstacles. But if you can imagine, if you become more stable and don't have so much neurosis and don't have so much craving and neediness, therefore don't have much anger or depression, therefore don't get anxious and neurotic and jealous and mean and proud, then your life is fine, no matter where you are. I mean, I'm not saying I've achieved that, but that's what I'm seeing. As you progress internally, so life gets easier, no matter how bad the world is. And the world is pretty suffering, isn't it? Yeah, isn't it? Exactly. So, but also one more point, the West, just the last 30, 40 years since I've been a Buddhist, there's an enormous hunger. I mean, I'm seeing here in Romania, I was in Bucharest, I was astonished by just the enthusiasm, the enthusiasm. Even here, I'm not surprised, I don't have any expectation, but there really seems to be enthusiasm for just these ideas, the ideas that Buddhism talks about. I think in a very down-to-earth psychological way, because we want to understand our minds, don't we, all of us.
Let's talk a little bit, please, about compassion.
Yes.
A second wing.
Yes, exactly, the second wing. Well, compassion, in the end, compassion is the point. Kindness to others, empathy, helping others, because we're all very social beings, aren't we? We live very interdependently. And we can see all our happiness is dependent upon good relationships and our suffering is dependent upon lousy ones, So we're clearly social. But the Buddha's idea is you can't run around helping people if you don't even know your own self. You make a mess. So if I'm full of anger and depression, I can't even help a fly, So that's why the wisdom, you've got to do some semblance of work on yourself first. And to the extent that I've got a little bit more clarity, a little bit more harnessing of my crazy energy, to that extent can I be useful to others. But even more simply, if I'm caught up in my own misery, literally I can't see past my own nose. And I will see you, my boyfriend, let's say, I will only see you, and this is the part that Buddha would say, it goes real deep. I think I see Vasily. But if I'm very jealous and very angry and very attached and very needy, I literally see a fantasy of you made up by my neuroses, and that's the really shocking part. We kind of know that, but Buddhism takes that to a great depth. That I see you through the lens of my rubbish or my goodness. So if I've got lots of anger and fears, how can I help anybody? It's not possible. Usually with our own neuroses, we just see everybody in terms of whether they satisfy my needs. It sounds kind of cruel. If there's some space for some love and kindness towards you, but if you keep not doing what my attachment wants and don't come home on time and, are mean to me, I'm not going to be kind to you. Why should I? I'll probably kill you. So I've got to do some work on myself first. Then I can also see, oh my goodness, we're all in the same boat. Then you have more courage to be able to be helpful to others, So that continues to progress. So, of course, compassion is the point in the end, but as the Dalai Lama often says, it's not enough. You've got to have some wisdom, and that comes from working on your own mind. And it's progressive, it's gradual, So the compassion wing, another big problem with compassion, we see the world as a suffering place. And if you've got a tendency for lots of people have great compassion, they see the suffering, they can't, but we don't know how to deal with it, so it becomes unbearable. Or, like a person in my type who gets very angry and volatile, that was why I was a radical lefty out there demonstrating, trying to change the world, but sort of trying to bash the world into the shape that I thought it should be. You understand? Yeah. But then in the end your compassion disappears, just becomes rage. And it's very distressing. So I remember Dalai Lama was being interviewed by a journalist. And anyone can see from hearing his words the last 60 years actually, he's this happy, funny guy. He's got a nightmarish situation, his country destroyed, continues to be destroyed, thousands every day coming still out of exile to Tibet, out of Tibet. But he's stable, steady, doesn't lose the plot, doesn't seem to have anger, and yet never stops trying to change it. So, then you can see the immensity of the compassion, but not polluted by all the unhappiness and the distress, because suffering can make us crazy, So I'm seeing even myself working with people in prison, 20 years. There's intensity of suffering in prison. The people who want to work on themselves, but because, say, in America, the sentencing, the prisons are like hell, the gang activity is enormous. It makes you go crazy. People lose their minds, you know. So when you're in that situation, it's so hopeless, and you know you can't open the door and let them out. So easily it can become very overwhelming because you don't know what to do to help. So that's why I see even a little bit that the more you work on yourself, the more courage you have, because you accept that you can't make everything perfect, and the suffering doesn't make you afraid. So you do what you can to give people courage, inspiration, be kind to people, and that's the best we can do, and that's huge.
When you said get real, what do you really mean?
Well, in one way, you know,
who you are, who you really are.
No, no. Well, somebody said that. I don't know where that title came from. Somebody said that. I didn't say it. But get real is good. It's good. The Buddha's way of saying that is the more we're caught up in anger and resentful and jealous and low self-esteem and victim, you're completely living in a fantasy world. So get real means, you know, if you say, if you like,
don't be delusional.
Don't be delusional. Delusion is one of the words Buddhism uses for anger and jealousy and attachment. I mean, I'm delusional when I believe you're the cause of all my happiness. It's a complete insanity to think that. I'm delusional if I really believe now I've found happiness and it's all perfect and it'll last forever. We know things change. So in literal sense, the more anger I've got, if I'm so paranoid and angry, I'll see demons everywhere. That's literally delusional. If I really think I'm the worst person in the universe and want to kill myself, literally that is delusional. You are not the worst person. If you're so arrogant, you know, that's delusional. So in the most simple sense, Buddha says these ordinary emotions we all have this aspect of being deeply disturbing, that's clear, but also completely causing us to be in la-la land, therefore deeply suffering, therefore not seeing other people clearly. So get real means strip all this rubbish away, see things even in a relative reality, you know, more sensible. We've got this marvellous potential to be more clear and capacity to change ourselves, not just become hopeless victims. So for me, that's the one. And never give up on yourself, and never give up, never give up. That's my piece of advice to everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vasily.
It's been
very
honor
much.
to have you in our
Good, okay.
Vă mulțumesc și dumneavoastră pentru că ați fost alături de noi. Aceasta a fost Transilvania Culturală de astăzi. Toate cele bune!